Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Curtis, your host and chief monkey, and this is the Wall Street Oasis podcast. Join me as I talk to some of the community's most successful and inspirational members to gain valuable insight into different career paths and life in general. Let's get to it. In this episode, John LeFevre, author of Straight to Hell and popular Twitter handle GSElevator, joins the WSO pod to discuss his volatile career path. We learn about what initially drew him to Wall Street, why he left after a decade, and what he's up to now with a variety of startups. I think John's path is a great reminder of some of the dangers young finance professionals still face today. The temptations, the drugs, the potential erosion of character, and the chase for money is still something that I think is very much alive and relevant. Also, check out his latest entrepreneurial endeavors, including thewhim.com, which is a collection of interesting content around lifestyle, finance, and travel, and brummelco.com, a fashion startup he launched a few years ago. Enjoy. All right, John, thanks so much for joining the Wall Street Oasis podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So it'd be great if you could just give the listeners a short summary of your bio for the ones that don't know who you are.
Sure. My name is John LeFevre. I was an investment banker. I joined Salomon Brothers on the fixed income desk in 2001, so right after the dot-com bubble burst, and I worked primarily in fixed income capital markets and on the syndicate desk in New York, London, Hong Kong, and Singapore through the financial crisis, and then left the bulge bracket buy sell side and started a capital markets boutique in Asia. Did that for a couple of years and then kind of got bored with the industry, and having always been somewhat cynical on Wall Street culture and having collected stories and notes from my experiences, I decided to shift over into the publishing world and wrote a book about Wall Street culture, and kind of along with it set up a social media character GSElevator for the purposes of kind of promoting and building up a social media footprint in anticipation of my book coming out, which is now almost 5 years ago. The book was called Straight to Hell. It was broadly, commercially successful. I think it debuted number 7 on the New York Times bestsellers list and was optioned by Paramount for a movie, which is currently in development. Although the script is objectively terrible, so we can get into that later if you want. And then from there was faced, I did GSElevator for a couple of years and got kind of bored with, there's only so much you can say in terms of illuminating and satirizing Wall Street culture through the lens of, the worst parts, the worst aspects of the culture in terms of the racism and the classism and the misogyny and the corruption and deviance. And so decided to shift, having at that point, 1.25 million followers across, various social media channels, shifted into more entrepreneurial initiatives, obviously started a fashion line, looked at expanding or evolving the GSElevator footprint into more of a kind of a media type entity. And more recently, I've been looking at kind of private equity and other opportunities that come my way. So
it's awesome.
A short, synopsis. I'm sure we can break those components down over the course of the conversation.
One of the more interesting backgrounds we've had on here, so I'm excited to break down some of it. And the podcast you just released, do you want to promote that? I give it a little shout out right now.
Yeah, I think we can get into that in a little bit greater detail later on, but obviously it's all part of the evolution of GSElevator, which as a Twitter character, you're limited to 140 characters in character. And so, I evolved beyond that and started writing longer form content for outlets like Business Insider and CNBC, fashion guidance, business etiquette, how to get a job on Wall Street, why Wall Street is still a good place to, start your career, general things like that. And it seemed to really resonate with a lot of people. And so most recently kind of evolved that into a podcast, which the idea really is that we have an eclectic group of guests across, business leaders, influencers, political figures, things of that nature, and just have general topical conversations on current events or, lifestyle guidance or, anything and everything really.
That's awesome. So let's go all the way back. It's interesting because you went to prep school. I went to prep school. You went to Choate. I went to Andover. Way back, we were actually in high school about the same time. was kind of Wall Street on your radar then, like all the way back then, or was it more once you were an undergrad?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I devoted an entire chapter to in my book to that exact topic. So I was probably a sophomore in high school when I read Liar's Poker, and I thought, man, this is really, really intriguing. This is the direction I think, I want to go in. And so, I really knew that at age 14. And part of that stems from just looking around. Obviously, Choate is, just outside of New Haven, which is, 45 minutes from Greenwich, Connecticut. And so a lot of the kids that I went to school with were sons and daughters of Wall Street titans and financiers and people like that. So, you had Ivanka Trump and, Brett Icahn, who's Carl Icahn's son. And you saw the Wall Street dads come to campus in their, nice cars, and the type of advice that they gave their kids, a great piece of advice, which I kind of gleaned from them, which was kind of, rules are for the obedience of fools and the guidance of wise men. So it was basically this mentality where you got to pick and choose which rules that you chose to abide by. And so when we were in prep school, and we went to go party in New York City for the weekend and get crazy, we would just sign out to, somebody's house in Greenwich, because obviously, as you know, from Andover, the rules are pretty strict. And so it was always kind of the Wall Street dads that let us break the rules and, sweared with impunity and just seemed to have the most fun. And so from there, I thought, okay, I want to go work on Wall Street. And having read Liar's Poker, obviously, I said, okay, I want to, this time it's kind of .com era. Everybody wanted to go into equities and tech and IPO. And I said, well, I just want to go join the bond desk at Solomon Brothers. And so that's what I did. I got an internship in London when I was in college on the Solomon Brothers floor, the same trading floor that, where Liar's Poker took place. And then everything kind of took off from there.
Do you feel like, what about your background, your parents? Were they at all like not happy about it? Were they like, encouraging, just supportive? What was that like?
Yeah, that's a bit nuanced, because on one hand, my dad ran the commodities desk at Merrill Lynch in the 1970s, okay. But kind of retired early and decided to just throw everything behind and leave, got so sick and tired of the industry and moved to rural Texas. So I grew up in a small town about an hour north of Houston, and it couldn't be any farther from Wall Street. So on one hand, I had the natural connection there, but on the other hand, when I showed up to Choate, for boarding school, I was just some rural kid from Texas.
Do you feel like a little bit of your path is kind of like your dad's almost in a way, where you started and then you basically did a complete 180 and changed? Do you realize that, or do you acknowledge that?
In a way, my path kind of mirrored his, in that, I spent a dozen years fully entrenched in the culture and in the industry, and then reached a certain point, 2012, 2013, where I just got really, really sick and tired of the industry and the culture, and wanted to just go completely to the other end of the spectrum. I mean, it was like a pendulum that just swung. I mean, I lived it, day and night for so many years that I just got really burned out.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about just that. So you're in college, you kind of, the initial interest is it sounds like in high school, given kind of your peers and all the cool Wall Street dads, we'll call them. And so you're basically at undergrad and you know what you want to do from day one. You're getting the right internships, you're doing all that stuff. Was there any kind of stumble, or like in terms of interviewing, anything like that? Did you feel like you were ready, or?
No, and I've written about this cynically when I've written about kind of how to get a job on Wall Street, how to ace the interview, or how to excel in your internship, which, we can flesh out some of the content from those articles. But really, it was, I don't know, not to sound arrogant, but it was an exceptionally easy path. And I'll qualify that statement by saying it was easy in the sense that, freshman year, after freshman year of college, I, through a family connection, I got an internship at a futures and options boutique in London. And so if you think about it, for most college kids, not a lot of them have the ability just to fly to London for the summer and not worry about budget constraints or applying for serious internships as a freshman or sophomore in college. I mean, I remember, that wasn't even really my first choice. I was like, okay, well, I'll just go work for Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of dates me, I guess,
All right.
significantly. But, the feedback I always got as a freshman or sophomore was, no, you can't get these internships unless you're a junior. And so I kind of went the alternative route, but fortunately I had the means and resources to do it. The same with kind of sophomore year, went and worked for a kind of a finance oriented startup in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Same kind of deal. And then by the time junior year came around and I was applying for a job at Solomon Brothers, I had, I think, a pretty decent resume compared to a lot of the other juniors. And so I got the job rather quickly, on my own merits,
Mm-hmm.
and then received an offer at the end of my internship and just coasted through senior year and never had to really interview for another job after that.
So you kind of, I think, partially the connections, partially knowing what you wanted early helped you, and partially not being able to afford the trips to the internships out to London, was that those all played a role, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. To which, I say that because I'm not trying to take credit for all of my accomplishments. I mean, clearly I came in at a higher level than most
Yep.
people have the ability to, and I was fortunate in that sense. So I certainly
No, that's
acknowledge
fair.
that.
I think we're all starting off. I was very fortunate as well. So, I don't, I think it's very natural to, if you have your eyes wide open, you're being truly honest with yourself. I think it's good to realize, yes, you worked hard, but also there was,
And I've certainly reflected. I mean, when I left Solomon or Citigroup then, and we started a boutique firm, we hired 45 people in 6 months, and to do that, interviewed probably 500 people. And so I certainly have a certain self-awareness in terms of, I think, where I was given a head start and
mm-hmm.
what it would take if I hadn't been afforded that head start, in terms of kind of networking, in terms of preparing, in terms of focusing your academic studies. I mean, even when I was early in my college years, I was taking classes on options and, equity valuation, fixed income securities, and things like that. And so that
Yep.
when I got into the interview stage, I was exceptionally well prepared, to the extent that, even when I was being interviewed by first and second year analysts, I think in some cases I felt more knowledgeable on certain topics as it related to fixed income securities or,
Mm-hmm.
equity valuation than perhaps even they were.
Any tips for listeners on how to kind of be that well-versed besides books and just reading as much as they can?
Well, I think you have to be passionate about it. I mean, if I've enjoyed, the space for so long. I was exceptionally passionate about it. And so, the advice I have for kids now really is, figure out if you are passionate about it. So try and read through the Fabozzi fixed income securities book, which is a nightmare to get through. Study for your, CFA while you're in college. Most college libraries have Bloomberg terminals. Bloomberg offers free tutorials on how to use them. Get well versed on Bloomberg. I mean, those are pretty easy things to do.
Yeah.
Network with older students in the finance clubs and the business clubs. Look at what they achieve in terms of where they get placed at firms. Replicate the path that they took. Stay connected with them. And then one of the things which I always point back to as one of my biggest regrets is just networking, because even though I kind of coasted to some extent, even when I got to Asia, I was on the fixed income syndicate desk, which for people who aren't really familiar with that world, you kind of straddle the sell side, so the investment bankers and their corporate clients, and the buy side, so sales and trading, and their buy side clients, so the investors, the hedge funds, asset managers. And so you sit above the Chinese wall and you work right in the middle. So you have the perfect vantage point to kind of have all knowing access to everything that's going on with the bank. And to the extent that you do kind of public deals, typically, you're not a sole book runner on most transactions. And so you're doing deals with 3 or 4 or 5 banks. So you're doing deals with every bank on Wall Street. And it is, in terms of the allocation process, it is a global process. So you're working with colleagues in New York, London, Asia, irrespective of where you're sitting. And so that gave me exceptional access and exceptional credible vantage point from which to opine on the culture. I think the frequent refrain that you hear in terms of pushback from kind of Wall Street apologists is that there are always a few bad apples as it relates to, deviance and corruption. And I think from my experience, it was quite the opposite. But as that related to your question, in terms of what would be good, valuable advice for people, and certainly if I could go back in time, would be just network like crazy. And so one of my biggest mistakes, I remember I would do these road shows and with my New York colleagues and US colleagues in Asia, and we'd have, 40 investors at a lunch and 20 bankers and 10, kind of CFO, CEO level clients. And you go around exchanging business cards. I was, I guess, a little cocky. And when I walked out of those roadshow luncheons, I would just drop 40 business cards in the trash can. And these are all people now who have dispersed all over the globe in a variety of industries with varying degrees of success. They're corporate executives, they're tech startup founders, they're involved in politics and policy making, or they're senior at, banks all over the world. And I never really fostered those relationships. So it's important to network, even if you're an analyst or an associate going all the way up. But if you're a college student, I think it's important to network with the people that you envy 2 or 3 years ahead of you, and treat them as seek out them as mentors, follow their trajectory, emulate what they have done to achieve their success, and stay in touch with them. I think is fundamentally important. And
it's a pattern.
If you're not at a target school, it can make all the difference in the world. I mean, I wasn't at a target school, and obviously I had a leg up, but I think that mentality is what got me in the door, because certainly the big banks were not coming to Babson College to recruit kids like me. We had to go out there and find it.
That's fair. Yeah, I think that's a pattern we hear just consistently on this show. It's just like, I wish I had networked more. I wish I had been in touch, had realized how that one connection could make such a dramatic difference. And so that's great to hear. So tell me a little bit about it took a while for you to actually leave, right? So you said you got you were a trader for a while. You were on the desk. You kind of were. It sounds like you started partying in high school pretty hard. You probably partied through college. You kind of extended that through into your first few years at Wall Street. And, I partied hard, but not necessarily as hard as you did from what I've read.
Well, Asia is a completely different animal.
Talk to me about that.
Anything goes in Asia. So, the first day I arrived in Hong Kong on the syndicate desk, in that capacity, your deals are by nature, emerging market, largely high yield deals outside of, say Korea,
right.
Philippines, Indonesia, China, they're all, high yield credits.
Yep.
The head of hedge fund sales desk handed me the number of, just a number. I said, what the hell is this? He said, it's the, our drug dealer's number. You're going to need it. And the philosophy, I mean, we would, if there was a big bond deal where it was 8-10 times oversubscribed, we'd get calls from hedge funds taking us out, taking us on trips. And it was, quid pro quo, where the next day when we were allocating deals that they could just flip for an immediate profit, even if they didn't have any interest in the deal, was that they showed us a good time. We hooked them up on hot deals. Alternatively, if I had a private placement that, I was this close to getting over the finish line, I could call a few hedge funds who I thought, owed me favors and call in those favors. Or I could go out and, take them out or take them on trips or send them stuff. I mean, it was, Wild West. I remember competing for deals in Indonesia, and the head of capital markets at Deutsche Bank sent an analyst with a crocodile Hermes Birkin bag to hand deliver it to the, it was an Indonesian tycoon, hand deliver it to his wife in exchange for Deutsche Bank getting a high yield mandate that, generated $6 million in fees. So that type of stuff just happened all the time and happens still in the emerging markets in particular, in terms of the inherent conflicts of interest and the kind of corruption that takes place in the allocation process.
I feel like, it sounds like a little more Wild West, but I'm sure it happens even here in the US. I mean,
absolutely.
Maybe not to the extent, but
I would have hedge fund guys, they would find out a deal was, 20 times oversubscribed, and people think that it's some great sophisticated universe of, hedge funds. But these guys would call up and say, hey, I'm really interested in this Megatron deal, South Korean telecom company.
Yeah.
Put me in for 20 million. And I would say, Megatron, you mean Magnachip? They wouldn't even know the name of the deal, but they just heard that it was 10 times oversubscribed, and
they know thought we
owed them a favor, and they wanted 20 million bonds. I mean, that's how the allocation process happens. And it still does. I mean, you can't take those conflicts of interest out of the allocation process, because bankers have full discretion and they have to weigh in the broader interests of the firm, their next few deals or relationships that other groups within the firm might have with them, and foster those relationships on both the buy side and the sell side.
So did that actually wear on you, or was it just was it a lot of fun? I mean, it was always probably a lot of fun while you were going through it, but did it wear on you, or was it more like, I just want to do something different? Is that like, in terms of why you broke away?
Yeah, I mean, I think it broke away for a couple of reasons. One, after the crisis, it just got a lot harder to get deals done, and it just wasn't fun. It wasn't as fun anymore.
Yeah.
And so I'd always said, everyone has a bad day or a bad week or a bad month, but as soon as you start having, more bad days than good over a long period of time, it's probably time to go and do something else. I think the other thing about it, especially being in Hong Kong and Singapore, is it still is a little bit of, of a soulless existence, right? So it's like, see bonds, sell bonds, repeat, go out and party all night, wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, do the whole thing over again, and spend your weekends sitting by the pool, drinking cocktails. After a while, you realize that that's no real way to live a life. And so to our earlier point about that kind of pendulum shift, I was sitting there in Asia, just having, I started the boutique and then kind of had a falling out with the partners there that
Well,
I
tell
worked
me
with.
how long were you at Solomon? For a couple of years, right?
So yeah, I was there from 2000 to 2010, and then I left with my boss in Hong Kong and my boss from London, and we set up a boutique capital markets firm. That the idea there was that post-crisis, the banks were stepping back from a lot of the kind of SME clients who needed covering, because you can do a Republic of Korea or Indonesian sovereign deal in a day and a half. But if you're trying to do a private placement, $50 million or $100 million private placement for a Chinese company or Indonesian corporate that takes, 6 months to gestate and may or may not even happen, depending on what market conditions look like 6 months from now, they decided not to engage in any of that business. So we saw an opportunity there. And then a year later, which probably gets a little bit too complicated for this podcast, but I was poached away by Goldman Sachs to run their syndicate desk, which incidentally turned out to be the desk that would go on to do the one MBD deals. So it was probably a good thing that I wasn't there. I probably would be, dead or in jail. But a month after I signed, I had such a bad falling out when I left the boutique firm that I helped start, that they tried to enforce the non-compete clause in my contract, which kept me out of the market for a year over that non-compete. And after that point, to what we discussed about it being kind of a soulless existence, I said, there's more life than this. And I just kind of, having had roots in Houston,
you went for a while though. I mean, almost 10 years, right?
Yeah. Well, 10 years at Solomon, and then, a year and a half at the boutique, and then
so that's
a year contractually obligated to sit out of the market. And
how
then
did
I said,
you
okay,
like recoup? I mean, obviously there's substance abuse and stuff like that to help you keep going, but like, was there, like, when you're at the pool trying to like recoup on the weekends, is that enough?
You drink all day and go get, a 2-hour massage. I mean, that's how I recouped.
Yeah, you got to sleep a lot too, right? You got to sleep sometime, right? Did you feel like you were going to burn out or like have a heart attack or something at some point at like 35?
We definitely saw that. I mean, I didn't know this at the time, but the guy that I was replacing when I got sent to Hong Kong was a little bit older than me, and he was kind of this perfect, played tennis in college, went to Goldman Sachs, then Morgan Stanley, and then over to Solomon, ran the hedge fund desk in Asia, and then had the apartment on Central Park West and the beach house in the Hamptons, and gets out to Hong Kong and just goes crazy with the drugs and the women, and ends up fracturing his marriage and has to move back to New York. So you definitely saw the burnout. But for me, I mean, I never really saw that. I just got personally sick of it. I mean, I guess that's a sort of burnout, but I never really felt the kind of physical fatigue.
So tell me, as you're kind of thinking, once that non-compete's enforced, is this kind of when you start thinking, hey, maybe I want to do a book, or when does that start kind of?
Yeah. So when I started, I thought, okay, this is great. Here I am. I made it. And then you look around, I spent 2 years making PowerPoint presentations and thought, man, this sucks. And then you talk about the masters of the universe, and I look around the trading floor and I thought, man, first of all, these guys really define themselves as human beings based on their job and not a lot of other, I mean, I'm generalizing here, but I just found that people took themselves far too seriously and defined themselves primarily based on their job as opposed to any other aspect of their life, which to me was a little bit sad. And then I also looked around and I thought, man, there aren't that many of these people who are really that impressive. I mean, this is kind of, to some extent, monkey work. I mean, obviously it changes as you grow up, but that was my experience as an analyst. And so that was really when I started collecting notes with the intention of eventually writing a book about it. And then so when I left the industry and wanted to move back here, I kind of said, okay, well, I've been in Hong Kong, going crazy for 8 years. What's the opposite of that? It's probably a leafy golf course suburb of Houston, Texas. And so I moved back here, started a family, and that's when I kind of sat down to write the book and start the Twitter account, GSElevator.
So you started the Twitter account. It exploded very fast.
Yeah, remarkably fast. I mean, the timing was just it was right. It was mid Occupy Wall Street, and so I was sitting in a bar in Hong Kong right before I was getting ready to leave, and we were talking about Occupy Wall Street. And I was there with a friend of mine from Goldman Sachs, and he was talking about how his wife was on the Upper East Side at a dentist's office and mentioned to the receptionist that their insurance was covered by Goldman Sachs. And here she is getting I mean, there was so much animosity towards kind of bankers and Goldman Sachs in particular at this time that she got heckled with her kids, heckled out of a Upper East Side dentist office. And we were laughing about it and saying, man, if people, as much animosity as there is, if people really understood the deviance and corruption and disregard for basic societal norms and rules and the classism and racism and sexism and all this other stuff in terms of the bad behavior, they would be even more appalled than they already are. And so it was in that kind of drunken haze that I started GSElevator as kind of the premise of, things overheard in the elevators of Goldman Sachs, which was never to be taken literally. It were really just kind of quips that illuminated and satirized the investment banking culture and mentality, certainly the worst elements of it, which was largely what my experience was.
So it was obviously very a great way to get attention, incite kind of really a lot of emotions on both sides, either people thinking it's funny or people thinking it's like extremely horrific.
That's what I loved about it, because I had the frat bro universe messaging me and responding with saying, this is awesome. I want to go work on Wall Street. This is hilarious. And then I had kind of the slightly more sophisticated, older, on the political spectrum, probably more liberally orientated people saying, wow, this is great as kind of satire and illuminating an odious culture. And so the appeal worked across the spectrum, depending on the lens that people were looking at it through.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So it exploded like really fast. That immediately kind of probably just pushed you even more towards, hey, this book has to happen because it's going to be.
Yeah. I mean, that, again, I don't want to sound like a total ass, but that process also was pretty easy for me because, within a very short period of time, I had hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers, and I had, CNBC asking me to write for them. I had Business Insider asking me to write for them. And so I started contributing articles that were kind of a blend of humor, satire, and genuinely good advice. So it would be like, 25 rules of bar etiquette, or, airplane travel etiquette, or 99 rules to live by, or, Wall Street fashion guide, or, things like that, where again, it was supposed to be humorous, but there was a grain of truth in it. And I had written an article called How to Be a Man. I guess this was 2013 or 2014, end of 2013. Mm-hmm. And it had like 6 million views. And I think to this day, it's still the most read article in Business Insider history. And it just really exploded, How to Be a Man. And from there, I had a bunch of agents calling me saying, hey, let's put together a book proposal. And so teamed up with an agent, and we kind of roadshowed a proposal, which was simply a bunch of my tweets, an outline of what I wanted to write about for the book, and 2 sample chapters that I put together in, pretty quick order. And then from there had, 7 proposals from publishers. And then
you were a first-time author. Given your following, were you able to negotiate a pretty good advance? Are you comfortable sharing like what your advance was and all that stuff?
Yeah, so it's it was a mid 6-figure advance, which for a first-time nonfiction author is like the 99.9 percentile, which was amazing too, because that also put a big target on my back from kind of the finance journalism and FinTwit community. All these guys who had been working up to their entire lives, to get book deals or get published or find an agent, and I kind of fall into one. That's when I started to see a lot of animosity online, a lot of misinformation and smears, especially as I got closer to publication and Goldman Sachs and Citigroup were kind of incentivized to attempt to undermine my credibility with a lot of falsehoods, which is probably the most frustrating thing about this process. Because here I am thinking, of course, people know Liar's Poker and Barbarians at the Gate or Den of Thieves or Predator's Ball or even, Monkey Business or Turney Duff's great book, The Buy Side, which is a really great book.
Yeah, Turney's book was great. Yeah, I love Turney's book.
And here I am thinking, okay, I've collected these stories. I have this unique vantage point where I've worked with every bank on every continent from the dot-com bubble through the financial crisis and sat above the Chinese wall. It's a vantage point that hasn't really been explored because, there's obviously tens or hundreds of thousands of employees at any given bank, but for the equity and debt syndicate desk, there's only 10, 20 people, and you can only be in New York, London, a few guys in Frankfurt and maybe Hong Kong or Singapore, excluding kind of local market syndication. So it was a very prestigious desk to be on, and it was a very credible vantage point from which you can credibly opine on Wall Street culture. So to see those smears and attacks on my credibility were particularly frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, not frustrating, but also not surprising, given they're trying to distance yourself and say you're a hack of some sort, right?
And we had to, when I worked in banking, we did these bond deals and these roadshows. We had to work closely with the financial press to promote these deals. So I had good relationships with the corporate communications teams and a lot of journalists. And so right before my book came out, I had the corporate comms guy at Citigroup bragging about calling in favors from Fortune magazine or the New York Times to really negatively review my book. So I found a lot of, this was kind of fake news, but it certainly opened my eyes to the, how corrupt some of these guys in the media were too, and how intertwined. I mean, obviously, Bloomberg, I mean, I like Bloomberg obviously, but they can't, the financial services firms, pay their bills, right? And especially some of these Fortune magazine or Forbes magazines, I'm sure half of their ad revenue comes from the financial services industry. So they have to placate those guys, which I guess is understandable, but it was certainly a very corrupt process.
Interesting. Really interesting. So you released the book. It debuts around number 7, you said?
Yeah.
New York Times bestseller list. So pretty solid. I mean, you get some royalties eventually after that advance kind of runs through, and
it sells pretty steadily. I mean, I think in terms of relevance, it's fairly evergreen, and I've continued to kind of evolve my focus in areas that keeps it, keeps the book, I guess, relevant. So the sales are pretty, it's not Liar's Poker. It's not a perennial top seller, but I still see steady sales and steady feedback from younger people who come up and probably weren't around, 5 years ago when GSElevator was more relevant, or when my book was being promoted, and they kind of come across it organically, or as they prepare for a career in banking or in finance in general, they hear about it and read it, and it resonates with them.
So from 2000, you started a family, you got married, you're in the burbs, and that kind of going 100 miles an hour to down to much slower lifestyle, I assume. What was that transition like for you? I mean, you're now like an author, you're right. You have that, and then potentially you're kind of free at that point, right?
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what happened. I mean, I was going 100 miles an hour, and I wanted to take it down to 0, and so I really did just spend a couple of years writing the book, playing golf, drinking, and having a couple of kids. And then, of course, that being the opposite of my traditional banking experience, now the pendulum started to shift back or normalize a little bit. And so, having taken a couple of years off to spend with my kids, who obviously were very, very young at that point, started to kind of re-engage and focus on new initiatives. And so the first thing I did was, about 2 years ago, I was looking at this, having 1 million followers and thinking, what the hell do I do with it? And I had written some, kind of fashion article for Business Insider that was really popular. And in it, I kind of advocated my personal preference as it related to fashion. And I said, I hate colorful, gimmicky socks. They don't add personality or fashion sense. I don't like pairing or sorting or color matching. And when I worked in finance, I would always just and I love the feeling of fresh, crisp, new socks. And so when I worked in banking, I would just buy, 10 pair of identical black Calvin Klein socks. And then every 2 months I would throw them away and get new ones. Yeah. And so I wrote about that a little bit, and I got an amazing amount of feedback from people saying, wow, it's a lifestyle choice. Like, this is just such an excellent advice in terms of just starting your day with fresh, crisp socks, not even thinking about the colors and wasting time or bandwidth doing anything else. And so a couple of years ago, I said, well, I've got this following, a pretty good demographic, 1.2 million, mostly male, finance orientated, aspirational, educated people. Might as well do something with it. And so I decided to start a fashion line, focusing initially on the neglected top drawer. So just socks, underwear, and undershirts. And so the first thing I did is I went to Neiman Marcus here in Houston and sampled 30 pair of socks and sent them off to a factory in China and tweaked the design a little bit to make them thinner and silkier and less cotton, because I don't like cotton. Yeah. More, it absorbs moisture and odor and bacteria.
Yeah.
More spandex in the cuff, so it doesn't slip. Little tweaks like that. And so I'm taking a $20 Neiman Marcus sock and finding a factory that can evolve it and replicate it for 90 cents or whatever the number is. And so and then the way technology had evolved up until 2 years ago, it was really easy to get into the e-commerce business, especially if you already have a social media following, because your customer acquisition cost is zero. And so I went from the factory in China to working with Shopify on the e-commerce side and working with ShipBob on the fulfillment side. And so without really having any overhead or employees, no other concerns other than, you have a proven product. It's a simple product. So as long as you're able to acquire customers, it's a fundamentally easy business to start up. And so did that 2 years ago. And
you want to say the name for anyone that wants?
Yeah, sure. It's called Brummel. It's named after Beau Brummel, a 18th century gadabout in London who kind of revolutionized men's fashion. And he kind of came along and said, hey, why are we wearing these dumb long tights? We should make our fashion statements with our wit and intellect, or even a watch or a scarf or a hat, anything but socks. And so that's the same kind of ethos that we have embraced for the brand. So it's just really, really simple, understated top drawer needs with a focus on value, convenience, and comfort.
And so you did this, and this was basically, it was almost like a subscription based, right?
It's
the idea that you replace every.
We do either. So yeah, I mean, theoretically we encourage subscriptions, but as somebody who traditionally, anytime you hear sock startup, you kind of roll your eyes. Most of these people are in this kind of colorful, gimmicky marijuana leaf socks or polka dot socks, or you see all these subscription services. So when I was looking at starting, I thought, man, this seems like one huge cliche. And so I wanted to be contrarian in terms of the focus, and that we went for simple, clean design, and then not just rely entirely on the subscription model. And so
I'm pulling it up now, Brummel. I'm checking it out. And so tell me, how has it gone? Is it something where you feel like it's just does it continually, have you done any SEO? Is it continually generating revenue, or is it was there a big surge? And then obviously after the promo, it kind of comes down to a steady state, but has it done okay for you?
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, obviously, I found whenever I used to buy, say you buy a Calvin Klein boxer brief and it has the logo is screwed up, or there's a tear in the seam. At the end of the day, it's just underwear. Who cares? Who cares? So, and it's a quality product regardless, but I found the return rate is less than 1%. The subscription cancellation rate is I think less than 1%. And so we're just acquiring customers and then gradually looking at expanding our product offering into higher dollar margin SKUs. And so you start by selling people, $7 or $20 Neiman Marcus sock for $7 and deliver it to them. And then you look at selling them, $30 undershirts and $25 underwear. And just at the end of last year, I rolled out a limited edition tie, which was, sold out pretty quickly. And so, anytime I wanted to acquire customers, I've written some content or used social media or, put out Instagram posts, which has been easy. I mean, obviously that's a well that you can't go to forever without seeing diminishing returns. And so, we reached a kind of an inflection point last year where we decided we wanted to kind of grow up and be, very serious in terms of going after some of our much larger competitors, competitors who are raising money at, $200-300 million valuations. Right. And so we closed a seed round with a private equity investment firm here in Houston at the end of last year. Congrats. And they're in the process of really ramping up, our fulfillment, getting our cost down a little bit, our SKU expansion, focusing on higher dollar margin SKUs, and then really a more sustainable CMO effort aside from just leaning on the social media platform and the content
I'm
creation
curious
site.
about that because, our business is very similar. It's our community presence helps us sell our interview courses, helps us sell our subscriptions to our company database, all that stuff. I'm curious, has there been any results in terms of like Facebook ads, Instagram ads? Have you tried any of the paid stuff? And has it been it's tough when you're selling a $7 stock, like you have very little dollars to play with in terms of acquiring the customer, right?
Right, but as long as you're acquiring the customer for life and that
Yeah,
you are confident in your ability to sell them higher dollar margin stuff later on, then the lifetime value of that customer goes well beyond a
of course.
single
Yeah.
purchase of one pair of socks. And so it's really amazing. When we started, it started 2 years ago. Let's call it a year and a half ago. Our average ticket size was probably $32.
Mm-hmm.
And now, having just added a few SKUs, our average sale is probably $85. And
Wow.
we're really only getting started on the higher dollar margin stuff. As it relates to your specific question on kind of being really aggressive on the Facebook and Instagram ads, it's actually something that we haven't really employed. So we're still in the process of putting together the video content and working with the team out in California to get that stuff rolled out. So you'll start seeing a really aggressive push from us probably over the next couple of months.
It's just exciting. I love the startup stuff. As you can tell.
Yeah,
we could talk
fun.
about we could talk about this
fun.
for hours. So okay, so you've done that. That seems to be going great. Are you doing the day to day on that, or working a few hours a day on that, or what are you spending your time most of your day now?
Yeah, so we closed the seed round last year, and we're just ramping that up now. So that's occupying a large portion of my day. And then I've started working with the private investment firm that participated or led our seed round in looking at other deals, kind of dusting off the toolbox. And so we're working on a kind of healthcare related startup, which will be launching in about 2 months, which I can't really get into detail on, but I think we're very, very excited about that. And we've been looking at the kind of continued evolution of GSElevator's, social media footprint in terms of it being a kind of almost like a media company. So looking at a couple of different books, looking at the podcast, a website. I found the media space to be very kind of siloed. Take like, Business Insider, or even at a political level, right? Like, we went to boarding school, right? Most of your friends and my friends are probably left wing. In this election cycle, even the previous election cycle, if I got into a political conversation with somebody and sent somebody a Fox News link or a Breitbart link, they won't even click on it. And conversely, if I got a Huffington Post link, I immediately dismiss it. And so I didn't really see a place on the internet which appealed, because, I look at Twitter as kind of the curation, which I think Twitter is really a big part of my life, and that I can wake up every morning and in 10 minutes go through my curated Twitter feed and have a better understanding of everything that's going on than if I'd spent 2 hours, going through ESPN and the New York Times,
Right.
TMZ and, the real estate section of Sotheby's or Travel and Leisure or whatever it is. And so I didn't think there was a home for people that reflected those eclectic interests, and also a home that combined created content. Because as you know, it's hard to run a sustainable media company and rely entirely on created content without a massive upfront in terms of capital. But if you're able to consistently create decent quality content and then blend that in with curated content, I think it becomes imminently more sustainable. And so I thought there was a place for that, as well as layering in different content categories, such that one place where you have traditional content, you have video content, you have podcast content, you even have meme content. Almost you say, okay, we can get a small group of guys and they can spend 8 hours a day on Reddit, so that everybody else doesn't have to, or they can spend 8 hours a day curating memes from Instagram, so that everyone else doesn't have to. And I think there's value and appreciation for that curation, and I don't think a lot of people are doing that good of a job in terms of a destination that brings all that together and isn't singularly focused on, say, finance or politics or
Right.
current events or sports. It just curates
Like a blend of across
a blend of across that. So we started a website which is still in beta test right now called thewim.com, which we're pretty excited about. It's sort of like this isn't a great description of it, but I would say it's almost like Business Insider meets Drudge Report, with a cleaner, more updated aesthetic. And so I think that's going to be an increasing focus of mine moving forward. And then we're going to layer in with that kind of a podcast. And so we were looking at starting the podcast, which is something I've thought about for a while. Okay, we have all these followers. I know a lot of people that are influencers or well-known figures in the business world or the media world or the political sphere, who follow GSElevator on Twitter. I can reach out to them and get them on my podcast. The investment firm that we work with has an extensive Rolodex here in Houston as it relates to professional athletes and business leaders and people like that. We can get them on the podcast. I know this from when I wrote the book. My publicist and my publisher made me go on every single podcast they were asked for me to do, regardless of how big or small. I mean,
right.
Exaggerating there, but generally speaking, I had to do a lot of podcasts that I didn't want to do when I was promoting a book. And so another strategy of ours is to reach out to publishers and publicists and say, hey, this book is coming out next month or next week. Here we have now, when I add the WIM to GSElevator, combined, 1.5 million followers across, a very diverse group of social channels in a way that not a lot of people do, in terms of having, 100,000 people on Instagram, 400,000 people on Facebook, and 900,000 people on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. It's a pretty compelling case, and I think it's going to be easy for us to kind of bring in some exciting guests and really get the podcast rolling. But it's something that we're really it's kind of at its infancy right now. It's called the Grays.
The Grays. Cool. Okay.
It's kind of part of under the WIM umbrella, and we're just going to combine that with all of the legacy GSElevator stuff, both the kind of evergreen content as well as the social media footprint. So that's kind of what my focus has shifted to now. So fashion, the healthcare startup, and now this media initiative, which
sounds like you're busy.
A lot of fun.
Sounds like you're super busy. That's awesome.
It's good fun to have. I mean, obviously it's, I spent 2 or 3 years just, playing golf, drinking, and hanging out, changing diapers. So it's kind of nice.
I'm in that stage. I'm in that stage right now. I'm still changing a lot of diapers. So it's nice to be out of it, I guess. Tell me it gets better. Nice. But anyways, anything before we call it, anything you want to share with the listeners, kind of, or advice you'd give to your younger self, kind of not knowing what you didn't know, not knowing that your path would be so winding? Anything you tell yourself?
Yeah, sure. I guess I guess I'm not trying to do a shameless plug here, but I did write 10 reasons why Wall Street is still a great place to start your career. And again, this is kind of a cynical approach. How to get a job on Wall Street, and how to kind of excel as a new hire or even in your summer internship. And I shifted all that content. It's been amazing to me because, taking a step back, this content, the GSElevator content, is so evergreen that, the legacy stuff still gets a couple 100,000 views every month. And I wasn't really doing anything with it. And so that's another component of this media initiative, is to keep that evergreen content living and breathing and updating it and tweaking it and making sure that it stays relevant. So all that old content, which I think can be valuable, especially to some of your younger listeners, 15 books to read if you want to work on Wall Street, how to dress on Wall Street, the hierarchy of watches on Wall Street. I mean, just all that stuff is readily available on thewim.com. And we're going to be increasingly more aggressive in terms of generating new relevant content, and then kind of layering that in with our more recent Instagram initiative. I mean, we just started on Instagram less than 6 months ago, and we have 80,000 followers, and so it's been fun. I didn't think I would like it, but that's been fun. In terms of advice I would give my younger self, I mean, I guess it kind of aligns with a little bit what we talked about earlier. Just network like crazy, figure out what your passion is, and then find the people that you look up to in that space and emulate what they have done to achieve that success. And then, of course, the minute you're not happy, just go do something else. Life is too short. But I guess that kind of covers it.
That's great. Well, John, thanks so much for taking your precious time, your busy time to come on the pod. We really appreciate
No,
it.
thank you. I appreciate it. And then hopefully, we can collaborate in some scope here with the podcast stuff over the next couple of months. And I'm sure there's always,
For sure.
there's always scope to get in the weeds on, interview tips or, intern tips or whatever it is. I think there's plenty of areas here we can always find something to talk about. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'll talk to you soon.
And thanks to you, my listeners at Wall Street Oasis. If you have any suggestions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to send them my way, Patrick at wallstreetoasis.com. And until next time.